Hello, everybody. Welcome to another show for the History Valley podcast. Today, I am joined with Dr. Robert M. Price, a frequent guest of the channel. And today, we're going to be talking about Ignatius of Antioch. Ignatius of Antioch is one of the early apostolic fathers living in the early 2nd century CE. And he supposedly wrote a series of letters. And these letters are often used as evidence that the New Testament in its entirety must date to the 1st century CE. It is all the letters are also used as evidence to date the first bishops to the 1st century, or to support the idea that a system of bishops that existed in the 1st century. And yeah, that's pretty much what his letters are. It's also very complicated, like the Paul problem we discussed previously. Ignatius has multiple redactions. There's the shorter, the middle, and the longer recessions. And there's huge debates about which one is the original one. Although it just seems to me, from my gloss over the text, that I guess I would imagine, this is just me, that the longer a text gets indicates that that text is younger. As it gets longer, someone's modifying it over time. I would imagine that the shortest text maybe would be the closest to the original, but that's just me. I don't know if you would agree with that, Dr.
Yeah,
Price.
that seems to stand to reason. It seems the more highly esteemed a text was as being holy, whether they had a canon in mind or not, those who copied it would think it better to enhance and enlarge it than to cut it to pieces. And I don't like this, I'm cutting it out. So what if the guy is a martyr and a confessor? I know better. I mean, that's possible, but it doesn't seem likely. And we take this approach to textual criticism of the New Testament too. It's far more likely that these guys with a sacred text in their hands are going to, if there's some doubt, like if they're looking at two manuscripts as we do, and one of them has, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do, and the other one doesn't. Well, what are you going to do? Did somebody, some previous scribe, add the saying because he thought it appropriate, or did another scribe just cut it out accidentally? He thought he'd reached the end of the punchline, and in fact, the previous line would have been good. But he just didn't notice it, and that's that. So, what do you conclude? There's no way to know, and they always seem to have played it safe and said, well, somebody thought this or knew this was part of the text. Who am I to say otherwise? I don't want to be the one cutting out part of the word of God. I'm leaving it in. And you think it's the same thing here, because the fact that they preserved these epistles and they were really big stuff, it's pretty much like they're considering it scripture. And it's very, and think of pseudepigraphy, right? If somebody is adding stuff like Deutero-Zechariah, adding chapters to the book of Zechariah, and there are hints in there that that's what's happened, because it says in part of it, if any more supposed prophets show up, stone them to death. What? Well, that kind of implies that somebody had something of a prophetic nature to say, but they didn't dare say it under their own name. So they said, well, they regard Zechariah as legitimate. What say I put it in under his name? You do the same thing here. Ignatius was a smart guy. He must have been as smart as I am, and this is what I think. So I'm pretty sure he'd have said the same thing, and now he did. So it's, I think, far more natural to assume that they kind of grew in the telling.
So, do you think Ignatius of Antioch could have written anything that's in those letters, or do you suspect or believe that they're all fake?
Well, there's nothing in there he absolutely could not have written, but there's so much room for suspicion that I think they're not genuine, any of them. As you said, there are these different recensions of them. I guess I know what the word recension denotes, but I've never been sure what it actually means. Anyway, there are these different versions of it, and there's uh, like they're short, like you mentioned, the short versions, and then the long ones, and then a middle length version. So it looks like it kept on growing. But also, there aren't just the seven. The collection actually has 14 letters with Ignatius's name on them. And John Calvin, who we usually do not consider some sort of a higher critic, he said, no, wait a minute. Seven of these have to be bogus. And I think some people say, well, he just thought that because it was a little too Romanist for him, a little too Catholic tilting. Like one of the extra letters is addressed to the Virgin Mary. Oh, Calvin wouldn't have liked that. Sure, he would. These early reformers were still pretty Catholic on stuff like that. Calvin and Luther and these guys believed in the perpetual virginity of Mary and all this stuff. So that wouldn't have been a problem for them. But none, though I'm not sure what the reasoning was for him to discount half of them, but he did. He thought he certainly didn't think, oh, no Christian would, sign somebody else's name to a letter he had written. He didn't. He wasn't that dogmatic about these things. So he said, oh yeah, he didn't write them all, but half he did. Well, as with the pastoral epistles, like Schleiermacher demonstrated early on that Paul, who he thought wrote Second Timothy and Titus, couldn't have written First Timothy, and he goes into all kinds of lexical and conceptual reasons for that. Well, it didn't take long before somebody else was saying, well, you can really make the same sort of arguments about Second Timothy and Titus. And then the dam broke, and you get to F.C. Bauer saying, I don't think he wrote anything but Romans, most of it, Galatians, and First and Second Corinthians. Here's why the other ones don't pass muster. Again, vocabulary, theology, comparing them with the four principal epistles. And then he was surprised to see when Bruno Bauer, no relation, said, you're not being consistent. If you apply the same criteria to those four, you're going to find that they couldn't have been written by the same author either. Yikes. Well, F.C. Bauer never went along with that. And then generation later, Bultmann, whom some think of as the arch skeptic, he then says, well, I think Paul did actually write seven of them. And most critical scholars in the mainstream follow that today. And so they think that Romans, Galatians, First and Second Corinthians, um, Philippians, First Thessalonians, and Philemon are all authentic. But I personally believe the arguments of F.C. Bauer, especially, still hold good. And as far as I know, no one really makes an attempt to defend them. It's just sort of assumed that I think that the lucky seven are the real thing, and some of the arguments aimed at the others could be aimed at those as well. And like one of my favorite examples is, um, did Paul learn his gospel directly from heaven, from the Lord, whoever he means by that, or did he get it from apostles who were in the job before he was? Because he says the first in Galatians, but the second in First Corinthians. How could he have said both? I mean, they're diametrically opposite, and each one has big implications. And so you really have to ask, did the same guy write this? And then you put it under a microscope even more, and you look at First Corinthians and say, wait a second. Did the same man write chapter 7 and chapter 8, chapter 12 and chapter 14? It doesn't sound the same. It looks to me more like somebody didn't like what they first read that Paul might have written, and then decided, I'm going to give equal time to the opposition, namely me. And so once you start looking for these things, my professor Darrell Dowdy, I like the way he put it. He said, we used to think that the Gospels were seamless fabrics that people recorded, like the whole Sermon on the Mount, for instance, as if anybody could remember it from one hearing, right? And Dowdy said, now we realize that there's a big lack of continuity, that the narrative just jumps around all over the place from subject to subject with no real transition. Why is that? Bad writing? No. It's just a sign that these books are compilations of little bits and pieces that the redactors or whatever collected, and with apparently minimal alteration. And then so Dowdy said, "Okay, we've got that settled. Critics do anyway." When we notice the same thing in the Pauline epistles, we just start racking our brains to find some thread of logical cohesion. He says whole commentaries are filled with explanations for how the heck Paul got from point A to point B. It seems like a different topic or an opposite treatment of the same one. What must he have been thinking? Well, maybe he introduces theme A here, and some aspect of it is fulfilled down in point C, and that's the ticket. And it just seems like, why don't you admit that somebody has simply compiled these things like a patchwork quilt? Like the Upanishads, for instance. There's over 100 of these mystical treatises in India, and we think of there being 12, 14, 15, something like that, basic ones. And each of those very clearly has been heavily interpolated and redacted, and you have whole different concepts from verse A, of God concepts from verse A to verse B. This passage is monistic, this one is polytheistic, this one is pantheistic. What the heck's going on? Well, these texts were viewed as repositories of little religious gems, whether or not they fit together. So I don't think it's at all far-fetched to do this sort of analysis and to doubt the literary integrity, that is, all written by one person or not. And similarly, then in the whole corpus, as they call them, of all these epistles, were they all written by the same person? And okay, one other thing about, well, there's more than one other reason to worry about the Ignatian epistles. One is that they appear to be anachronistic in their ecclesiology. You pointed this out already about the bishops. In Philippians and 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, which seem to be late epistles, at least the three pastorals, their references or even discussions of deacons, bishops, and all of that. And that's one of several clues there that those are later than the other so-called Pauline epistles. Whoever wrote those didn't write the pastorals. Well, it's worse when you compare Ignatius's letters with anything in the New Testament, because not only does he have bishops, he's got monarchical bishops. There's a single bishop in charge of the church, and nobody does anything without getting his permission. He's like the vicar of God. Wait a minute, you sure don't get that impression even in the book of Acts, which is a 2nd century work already. So the ecclesiology seems later. And of course, later than not only the New Testament books, but even the ostensible dates of Ignatius. It just seems like and someone is trying to father these later arrangements onto Ignatius, who, though not an apostle, was a famous martyr. And they gave great heed to what martyrs and confessors said. They were uniquely filled with the Holy Spirit and all of that. So they were authorities. And they almost were secondary Christs. People would meet at the tombs of martyrs on their anniversaries, and they believed that the martyr was invisibly present and they could pray to him for miracles and so forth. I mean, this, you can see where the whole Catholic saint thing developed from. Well, so Ignatius, though not an apostle, might as well have been, because he was a martyr. So they figured, well, if we could place on his lips these endorsements of a monarchical bishop who must be obeyed, well, that had really, it's not just a good idea anymore. It's pretty much apostolic teaching, and you're going to have to obey it. I mean, if I just say, I think this would work pretty well, who cares what you think, Price? You're an idiot. But Ignatius wasn't an idiot. And so if the motive is easily discernible, that genre of faked literature, pseudepigraphy, is well known, especially for situations like this. And another problem is that they read sequentially, like as Richard Purvo said, like an epistolary novel. I just watched a couple of Dracula movies recently. I'm a big fan of the Count. And it took me many years to actually sit down and read the novel. And it's interesting to see that the novel Dracula by Bram Stoker is presented as a collection of letters to and from different characters and diary notes and things like that. Well, Purvo said that's kind of the way it is, both with the pastoral epistles and the Ignatian epistles. There's really kind of an ongoing story, like come back next week and see what Ignatius is going to say about this. And so maybe they were written to be read at a sitting or once a week in church or something. It's not like they're they're kind of self-contained. It's clear enough what he's talking about. And there's none of this stuff we have, like comparing Galatians, Corinthians, Romans, Philippians, that all stand apart from each other. And you'll have to look at little clues and say, was this one written before that one, or the other way around, or what? No problem with the Ignatian epistles. One takes up where the last leaves off, basically. You can tell they seem to be written to be read together, even though ostensibly they have different addressees. And the fanatical eagerness of Ignatius to be martyred, you really got to wonder about the guy's sanity. And it is such a caricature, you really start having to ask yourself, would any real person do this? Or is this more like one of these saints' legends where piety becomes masochism and fanaticism in a way that a real life person would think twice about? But old Iggy is saying, now, if you have the chance to intervene on my behalf and to prevent my martyrdom, please don't do it. I can't wait to feel the shreds of my flesh between the teeth of the lions. I'm not exaggerating. Like, this is such a caricature. He could have been a fanatic and a lunatic, granted, but it just seems like a kind of cartoon. And the last thing, I guess I'm kind of really dumping the whole forklift load here. Why was he being taken to Rome to be killed? He lived in Antioch of Syria. that's not that quick and easy a ride. Look at Paul coming from the same general place to Rome, the way the difficulties he had at sea and all that stuff. Why would they do that? Why, if they were going to execute him, why didn't they just do it in Antioch? Wouldn't that be more effective to discourage whatever heresies, whatever crimes against the state they accused him of? Wouldn't that pretty much underline the need not to do it? Here's what your bishop did, the big mouth. Now, you don't want this to happen to you, do you? Well, then don't follow him. That would make a bit more sense. Well, what was Ignatius's picture on the post office walls all over the empire? Was he on the FBI's most wanted list or something? That's anachronistic. So that makes you wonder, could it be that these were written in Rome and distributed back along the Ignatian way, as they called it, to these churches and individuals, so they would think they were getting the bulletins from Ignatius and take the warning? I don't know, but it would that makes some sense to me. And beyond that, there is an alternative version of the martyrdom of Ignatius. It only appears in, I think, a few hundred years later in somebody's church history. But the source for it seems to be passing on something that was believed to be an ancient report. Was it? I don't know. But it said that he was simply martyred, unspectacularly executed in Antioch. Now the question, it's like the old thing in biblical criticism. If you've got two versions basically of the same event, and one is very spectacular, the other pretty mundane, which would you guess is more likely to be historically true? Well, of course, you don't know. You don't have a time machine, but you would have to assume that the less spectacular one was the original, because if it was, you can well imagine people would say, well, it's too bad he got martyred, but I bet this would really make a bigger bang if the story was more spectacular. So it starts getting retold and it's more dramatic and more bloody and more pious as you go along. Now, if that's the way it started, who would ever dumb it down to a mundane thing? They just trotted him out and shot him. Like, no, you wouldn't do that, right? There'd be no reason for that. You want to glorify the martyr. Well, it seems to me that's pretty good evidence that the whole thing implied in the Ignatian epistles is spurious and legendary, though it pales compared to the martyrdom of Polycarp, which is just outrageously comical, unintentionally. So I think and this is not just my idea, by the way, the Tübingen critics already saw this. It's surprising to me that people still defend the authenticity of any version of the Ignatian epistles. So,
what makes it funny to me is the fact that you have 14 letters of Ignatius and people arguing seven of them are authentic, and it kind of reminds me of Paul. 14 letters of Paul, 7. It's just, I just think that's funny.
Even if you throw in Hebrews, then you got 14 and only 7 are authentic. Yeah.
Or you could throw in Laodiceans or 3rd Corinthians in its place.
Yeah.
I mean, at least those two claim to be written by Paul instead of Hebrews. What's interesting about Ignatius is in a later recession of his letters, is it says it actually mentions the Gospels, like flat out quotes them extensively, and then the first layer, what's called the first 7 Ignatius epistles, from the first recession, it doesn't do that. It quotes. It seems to have more gospel-like material. Now, some will say they're quoting the Gospels, but my point is there's a more or greater awareness of the Gospels in the later recession.
Why would there be that difference if they're all from the same guy? The only two things I can think of in the seven letters, one of them sounds kind of like the Matthean nativity story with the mention of the star, but it isn't a story, it's just an allusion about a star shining forth to proclaim the birth or something like that. It's a real great poetic passage. In the stillness of the night when all things were silent, the star or whatever. It's really good stuff, but it doesn't really sound like Matthew's narrative. There's no reason Matthew would be the only person to imagine a star heralding it. There were stories like that about Abraham, Julius Caesar, Moses, and so on. And the other one is a version of the Luke 24 resurrection appearance where Jesus says, why do doubts arise in your hearts? Touch me and see that it is I myself, for no spirit has flesh and bones as you see that I have. Well, in Ignatius, it says he appeared to the disciples and said, touch me and see I am not a bodiless demon. Well, that could be somebody's memory quote of that passage, but it could be an earlier version of it. I mean, there's an almost identical story in the life of Apollonius of Tyana. I don't really, but it doesn't sound word for word identical. If it did, I'd think, okay, we've got literary dependence here. But it isn't that close. And it just seems to me it's like form criticism. This is a kind of, there are plenty of resurrection, post-mortem appearance stories in Hellenistic lore. And once you realize that, you widen the scope a bit, you realize, well, this is just the same kind of thing. It doesn't have to have come one from the other. But that's it, slim pickings for the Gospels and Ignatius.
When would you say the first time that the Gospels are genuinely mentioned?
I'm tempted to say it might be Justin Martyr, but that's really complicated by the fact that he seems to have synoptic type sayings that are like half Luke and half Matthew. So did he get these sayings from something like the Diatessaron, some kind of a gospel harmony that tried to iron out all the contradictions? We don't know. I mean, it's kind of early for that. And he speaks of the memoirs of the apostles, but that really doesn't tell us enough to make sure we've got our gospels. I mean, there were plenty of people writing, Gnostics, Catholics, others writing what they said the apostles remembered about Jesus. So he could be referring to our gospels, though if he is, he's quoting them in a funny way. Well, like Papias, as you know, seems like he's referring to Mark and Matthew. But as David Friedrich Strauss pointed out a long time ago, there were other things supposedly written by these guys. And what Papias says about the two books don't quite mesh with the texts themselves. Did he actually read them? Did he know what they said? It's a big mess, so it's hard to say. But Walter Schmidthold speaks of the nearly apocryphal character of the Gospels until the latter part of the 2nd century. And I think that they probably were, well, I go along with Marcus Vincent. I think the best hypothesis I've heard is that they were beefed up versions of a draft that Marcion compiled and circulated to his students who thought it was hot stuff and started making copies for their friends. And then Marcion said, oh boy, This is just what I was trying to avoid. Well, now that it's out there, I better do a definitive job of it. And he may have incorporated some of the additional material others had added and formed our Gospels. And then you're talking about the mid second century. So based on that, I would say there wasn't a gospel to look at before then. And the reason I get that specific about it is it seems to me, and Vincent told me he agrees, that Marcion created the narrative of the Greek Gospels by rewriting Old Testament stories, just changing it from Moses to Jesus, from David to Jesus, Elijah to Jesus, and maybe combining some of it. But it sure looks like somebody did that. And it would make sense for Marcion to do it because, as you know, he rejected the Old Testament as not being a Christian book. He didn't think it was like Mein Kampf or the Satanic Bible or something like that. It's just, he would have said the same thing about the Quran. This just isn't about Jesus and Christianity. Stop pretending that it is. But in the same way, he couldn't have thought everything in the Gospels. Uh, I'm sorry, he couldn't have thought everything in the Old Testament stories was pernicious and nefarious. Oh, that's horrible. He must have seen value in it, but rather than just incorporate the whole thing and Judaism along with it, he apparently decided, hey, there's some great stuff in here. I'm going to Christianize it by making it about Jesus. That makes perfect sense to me. Where else would he have gotten the information he used? So I think if Marcus Vincent's right, and I think he is, we're talking about no Gospels before Marcion.
Well, how late are we talking about here?
Well, traditionally they say Marcion became active around 150, I think. But Joseph Hoffman's book on Marcion, who's about 30 years old now, he makes a very good case for saying, no, Marcion was earlier than that. I mean, there were Christian traditions, I think, as Robert Eisler argued that Marcion had been an amanuensis, secretary for John, son of Zebedee. Well, I don't think that's true, but the fact that anybody could even think that implies they associated them as at least roughly contemporary figures. And he points to a number of things that indicate Marcion was active earlier, so early in the second century. And yet he didn't necessarily write the Gospels right out of the starting gate. It assumes that he had some maturity and had established himself as a teacher whom students would seek out, that he could be taken seriously in his bid to become the Bishop of Rome. They're not going to give that to some neophyte. So I would think that the Gospels were written not all that earlier than Irenaeus and Polycarp. It seems to me that they were fairly new, if not hot off the press at that point, which is why nobody seems to have heard of them before then.
When do you think Ignatius's epistles were composed?
Oh, could be about the same time. I believe they always say, I don't know why the specific date sticks with me, but it seems to me I've heard people say that he was martyred in 117 CE. So pretty early in the game. But as to who actually wrote them, I'm guessing it would be, well, maybe like 20 years later. It would have to be when Ignatius was still widely revered so that his name would be enough to lend his posthumous authority to these things. you could gauge it by Mariolatry, perhaps. I don't remember what he says to her, so called, in that epistle, not one of the seven, but that might give some kind of a hint. But the single monarchical bishop thing, that seems to me to be a later thing, but I'm not clear enough on how late that would make it.
How do you view the apostolic fathers in general? Do you think most of their writings are fake and written later by other people?
Um, I'm sort of inclined to think Polycarp is genuine, partly because I link him with the pastorals and Luke and Acts, um, but also with Irenaeus. And it's on the other side of Polycarp, to associate him with John, son of Zebedee, that I think we may be crossing the border into legend. But Irenaeus is pretty secure in the historical stream, and Polycarp was definitely associated with him. Um, let's see. And so I would think it's not unlikely that the letter of Polycarp is not pseudonymous. By the way, uh, P.N. Harrison, who wrote the great book The Problem of the Pastoral Epistles, he wrote another book called, I think, The Two Epistles of Polycarp. Boy, did I have a hard time hunting that one down. And he thinks that what we have as the single letter is really two put together, much as scholars say Philippians and Second Corinthians are compilations of fragments of letters, though by the same author. And that could be, I don't know if that makes much difference to the date. The Didache, nobody's ever been too sure, though the range of dating, I guess, from internal evidence, like the state of things, the apparently primitive character of the Eucharist, no reference to the atonement or anything. Scholars tend to date that late first or early second century, and to locate it in Syria because of some of, I think, of the agricultural references in it. So that, I mean, there's no real name given there. It's just called the Teaching of the 12 Apostles to the Nations. We don't know who wrote it. Nobody really claimed that. I mean, he's not saying the 12 wrote this. He's just saying this is what they taught, and here's our Reader's Digest version. So I don't think there's any pseudonymity or pseudepigraphy in that one. We don't know who wrote the letter to Ignatius. I don't think there is any other reference to any important person of that name, and there's no author's name on it. So I'm not sure when they tend to date that. Let's see. Clement, well, part of that depends on who you think Clement was, or if anybody named Clement wrote First Clement, since it's anonymous. Plus, like you said, when you have a text that is endlessly long, especially if it's supposed to be a letter, right? I mean, sometimes people wrote treatises in the form of a letter, but that was just a formality. It was really an essay, and it's like that's why Hebrews has no salutation. It really isn't a letter, even though somebody tried to make it sound like one at the end. Or First Peter is not really a letter; it's a sermon text for an Easter baptismal service. But Romans, same thing. It's he says his goal is to clear up misunderstandings of his message, and he's forthright and says because he's planning to go to Spain, he needs to stop for supplies and funds in Rome, and he knows he ain't going to get them if everybody thinks, or if half of the people think this guy's a heretic. No, you got nothing to fear from me. So he gives them a treatise, basically. And First and Second Corinthians. Second Corinthians is believable as at least a set of three letters, two complete letters, well, come to think of it, a fragment of a third, and then two brief fundraising notes, chapters 8 and 9. Um, and the occasion for these letters is made plain. It's believable. But then again, in general, I got questions about whether any of them are genuine, but this one does not bear howling indications of fakery. Uh, First Corinthians, though, appears to me to be something like the Didache. It's a kind of a manual and has the same structure as the Didache. Now concerning so and so. You have that introduced several times in both documents, and they're topical. The Eucharist, whether women can speak in church or not, factionalisms, spiritual gifts, speaking in tongues, and et cetera, et cetera. It sounds to me like this is a kind of church manual. Now, it's not impossible, though, that somebody did write that at the request of a church. So just because it's the one doesn't mean it's not the other. So it's a kind of an artificial format, but given the genre of it, it's not that odd. So, um, and then there's the big question of whether pseudepigraphy should be considered fakery or forgery. Bart Ehrman says, well, yeah, it should. And he quotes some of the ancients criticizing anybody that would do this. But he's really, I think, just listening to half of the debate, because there were people that apparently thought it was okay. And there are reasons sometimes to think that these works that can't really have been written by the ostensible author probably never fooled anybody, and nobody ever thought they would. Like there's a letter from Perictione, the mother of Plato, and it's philosophical. Is it really? Well, she could have. But it sure seems like somebody's just saying, let's pick somebody close to the big guy. And but there were epistles of Socrates and others that seemed to be spurious, of noted cynics. And it seems to me it's not far from saying, I wonder what Socrates would say about this that didn't exist in his day. I bet he'd say so and so. I've written stuff like that myself, though I didn't fiddle around with the names. Though I do write these columns, Zarathustra Speaks, and I say what I think maybe Nietzsche would say about certain things, though I don't expect that. I hope nobody thinks that Nietzsche wrote this stuff or that I want them to think so. It's just a kind of a stylistic gimmick. And it may have been back then, too. And so that sounds like liberal apologetics, but I don't think so. I think it's a fair judgment that was a writing gimmick back then, and doesn't really matter whether anybody was taken in, but they weren't necessarily supposed to be taken in. Although I would say Second Peter is probably qualifies as a pious fraud. I think there is an attempt to deceive there. For good reasons, but most of them, I don't think it really comes to that.
We have a super chat question from PMC. Thank you for your super chat. If Marcionite and mythicism are true, let me reread that. If Marcionite priority and mythicism are true, which generation of Christians do you think were the first believers in a historical Jesus? Do you think Polycarp and or Irenaeus were true historicists?
I don't see any reason to think they weren't. They in fact, one thing Irenaeus says really helps explain why early Christians leaders anyway, felt they had to historicize a mythic Jesus. When Irenaeus is arguing against the various Gnostics and other heretics, the guy had a sense of humor. It's actually kind of funny, legitimately, when he's spoofing Gnostic apocalypses and cosmologies and so forth, but he actually is accurate in describing what they said. He isn't misrepresenting them, he's just poking fun. And he says, look, you guys play Can You Top This? Each one of you has a revelation from the ascended Christ or the heavenly Jesus or whatever. Who knows where this is coming from? The pseudo Clementine said the same thing about Simon Magus. Who, you weren't even with Jesus. You never heard a word out of his mouth, and you claim to know what he's all about because you've had visions and dreams. You know, I ate a whole pepperoni pizza and had a vision of Jesus, but I don't think it was Jesus talking. It was the divine pepperonius. It was because of this that they said no. There's got to be some control. Who's really speaking for Jesus? Well, I'll tell you, us, we, the bishops, who were catechized by the apostles, who were discipled by Jesus, who strode about on the earth and taught many people, including our gurus. We got the copyright. We know what the guy said. We know if he said, blessed are the peacemakers or blessed are the cheesemakers, right? That's Franklin Graham. I can't stand that guy. He's at least he runs a charity. That's good. But he's a ninny anyhow. He has these commercials where he says, you should invite Jesus into your heart because Jesus said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Where, Frank, where does he say that? I don't think I've seen that in the Gospels. That in the Living Bible, maybe, or some fortune cookie. Where do you get off making up these quotes attributing them to Jesus? It's the very thing their apologists say no early Christian would have done, and the people that read those apologists are doing it all the time. Anyway, that's what bothered Irenaeus. Uh, why even use the name Jesus if we can't agree on who the guy was and what he taught to whom? We know that. You don't even care. So if you want to know what Jesus would say, ask us. Now, that's not going to work if you say, well, I got to admit that Jesus never really walked the earth. How do we know what he said? Well, we've had visions of our own. He didn't say that. He wouldn't say that. Now that might have been true, right? But they figured no, can't be. He must have been around on Earth in the same way we are. He had to be, and because it's real easy for theologians to do that, to move from what they need to be true to what they say they think is true, and that's maybe that's what they were doing, but nonetheless, that is one of the big motivations I think that led to historicizing a mythical Jesus. And Irenaeus, no doubt, was not among the first generation to do it, but he must have been pretty close. I doubt personally, like Richard Carrier and John Dominic Crossan, and I think Barbara Thiering, and no doubt plenty of others say that no, don't be stupid. Don't think the apostles were stupid, the gospel writers, I should say. You don't really think they believed a guy walked on water and so on. Right? These are all meant to be taken symbolically. The writers thought you'd be smarter than this, that you'd realize that. I hear that stuff, and I always think of Henry Cadbury, the great Quaker New Testament scholar at Harvard. He wrote a book called The Peril of Modernizing Jesus, or as I like to put it, using Jesus as a ventriloquist dummy, and so forth. Well, that's I think what Carrier, Cross, and the others are doing. They just can't believe that the gospel writers were less smart than they are, and so they must have agreed with them. I said it. Mark believed it. That settles it. It's the old ventriloquist dummy thing. So I think that there's a difference between writing fiction Like when Bunyan wrote The Pilgrim's Progress, he didn't expect anybody to believe that happened literally. And he didn't believe it, and no reader ever believed it. But when you set it up in a context where you say, here's our founder, he did miracles and that proved he was the Son of God. And look at the great stuff he said. That's a different sort of thing. It's no surprise that people that lived in a world of miracles and superstition, even if they were quite intelligent, inherited those beliefs and didn't think to question them. So I'm assuming the gospel writers, by and large, or the Old Testament writers whom Marcion rewrote, I would think surely they thought this was true. And as Strauss pointed out, the early Christians, who, of course, didn't have any actual memories of Jesus walking on the water or multiplying loaves and fish, they nonetheless thought he must have, because they were raised to believe that those Old Testament stories of the same kind, but having Elijah or whoever do it, they figured, yeah, those are true. Our God is great and did these things. And aren't we told that when Messiah comes, he will outdo even the great Old Testament heroes? Well, they just took that deductively to mean if they did it, Jesus must have done it and better. There's no, I mean, there's some bad thinking there, sloppy thinking, but that's not stupidity or dishonesty. And you can't just assume they knew everything we know. Like, did Jesus, when he's casting out demons, assuming there was such a person who did, is he thinking, well, it's a shame I can't tell these people about the Haberphrenic schizophrenia, because that's really what's going on here. I guess I'll just have to go through with all the mummery and the just to keep up the act. Is that what you think? I mean, it's like Jesus says, go to all corners of the earth, preaching the gospel. And he's thinking to himself, boy, if I showed these guys how to build an airplane, that would make their task so much easier. But I can't do that. It's not the right time. It's just ludicrous. And that's what they're saying, in effect. They don't seem to realize it. You're a very patient man, Jake.
So when do you think that the first Christians were around? Was it like simultaneously with Simon Magus or just before him? Like when? When do you think they first started existing, I guess, if that's the right way of putting it?
Probably in the first century, more or less. And the reason I say that is I find myself convinced by a book I mentioned last time, and I couldn't remember. I think I got it now. A book called The Origins of Christianity. Of course, there must be a zillion books with that title, but I think that is the title. The Origins of Christianity. And there are two authors. One is Etienne Nodet, Nodet. The other guy's name I can't remember, but looking up Nodet on Amazon, I'm sure you'd be able to spot it. He really gives the most convincing version I've ever heard of the argument that Essenism evolved into early Jewish Christianity, and the Simon Magus link. If Simon Magus was any part of the Jesus or apostolic stories, and he was the guy that Josephus mentioned, that's first century also. So there are, and if you take seriously the role of Pontius Pilate in it, he was remembered somehow in connection with it. It's not an open and shut case, but I think there are pretty good clues there. There's another question though, in that the influences on the Christian story go way back to the dying and rising gods of the ancient Middle East. Osiris, Tammuz, Adonis, Attis, Hercules, and various other ones, and even Yahweh. There's evidence that Yahweh and Marduk were dying and rising gods, and so the these Egyptian and Babylonian gods. There's no way that ancient Israelites were ignorant of these things. And it's obvious to me that already the Joseph novella in Genesis is based on Osiris, and it's there's so many striking similarities that I just think you better have a better argument than I ever heard if you want to say that there was no such influence on early Christianity. But that could easily have culminated by the first century, just like there continued to be such things.
What do you think about the later church fathers that also discuss Ignatius? Do you think what they say about him is reliable, or do you think what they're saying about him is unreliable outside of what the second century Irenaeus and others discuss about Ignatius, including Polycarp?
I don't really remember what kind of thing did they say.
Well, Eusebius talks about the martyrdom of Ignatius happening, I think it was 108 or 107 CE,
Oh, okay.
and um, there's a text written just after Eusebius, a martyrdom of Polycarp, that dates Polycarp's death about a decade earlier than Eusebius does.
Yeah, I'd be real suspicious of that because the martyrdom of Polycarp is just really silly. It's just like comically bad, already legendary. But well, we don't quite have that problem with Ignatius, and that date could be right because my gripe is where was he martyred? There's a real open question on that one. But yeah, that date for his martyrdom would fit real well with anything I know about it. Ignatius's.
When do you think the middle and longer recessions were written? I know that there are scholars that date them very, very late. Like some say the middle one's happening in the third century. And I think some will put the late one as, I think the late as the fourth century. I'm not sure. I don't remember at
I
this
wouldn't
time.
be surprised, though I guess this is not really reliable, but when you hear that Ignatius is writing to the Virgin Mary, that sounds kind of late to me, but I have to admit there's other stuff like the infancy gospel of Mary or nativity of Mary or whatever that I think is supposed to be a second century work, and it's already got all the legend of Mary in it. Um, so that I think would mark it as late, but I'm not. If I read it, it was so long ago I can't even be sure I have. I'd need to read it to see just how goofy it gets.
So you would not use it you would not use Ignatius as patristic evidence or really evidence for anything about Jesus or the New Testament. You would steer clear of that.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's anybody at any date could have written that stuff, and I know people like my friend William Albrecht, who's a really avid Roman Catholic apologist. He does not seem to question the traditions handed down by the church fathers, whereas to me, they you really have a hard time showing any of that as reliable. It seems all fanciful to me. So it's I guess it's in the eye of the beholder to some degree as to whether any of that stuff can be relied upon. And like the issue of the martyrdom of Peter and Paul, or a martyrdom of any of the apostles. I'd sure like to know about that, but the evidence we have does come from like the second and third century, and they're all just nonsense. Just if they were animated, you'd have kids laughing at them. Uh, it's and why? Why was this stuff that ridiculous? Why didn't anybody remember the facts? Well, of course, the big answer there is there weren't any. Right? All of those martyrdom stories of the apostles, with the exception of James, son of Zebedee, whom Herod Agrippa killed. All of them are predicated on the idea that the 12 disciples slash apostles fanned out across the ancient world to preach the gospel. But in the New Testament, there's no hint of that. And we're told that Jesus appointed them to sit on 12 tribes in the kingdom of God to govern the tribes of Israel. Well, that sort of fits in with the what I call the not so great commission of Matthew 10. Go nowhere among the Gentiles or the Samaritans. You just stick to the lost sheep of Israel. Uh, and you won't have time to do anything else before the Son of Man comes. Well, that was originally the end of one gospel source, and Matthew has just sort of clumsily stuck it in and has his own great commission with a wider scope at the end. Well, but that shows the tradition was these guys were active in Palestine. And where does Peter go? Where does John go in the book of Acts? Just up and down the seaboard of Canaan. I think Samaria, Philip the deacon goes to Ethiopia to speak to a guy who is coming home from the temple where he was at a Jewish celebration. So they're not going far afield. They're not supposed to. And when we meet Paul, he is the apostle to the Gentiles, not one of the apostles of the Gentiles. Oh, what about Peter with Cornelius? That's the exception that proves the rule. Luke is trying, as a Catholicizing rewriter of early Christianity, he's trying to cast Paul in the role of Peter and Peter in the role of Paul. So he makes Peter the first to speak to Gentiles, and it's just artificial. And what he says is what Paul might say. You can't really, if you covered the names, you wouldn't know which one it was supposed to be. And so it seems to me, if you look closely at it, Paul was the apostle to the nations. The 12 were the apostles to Jews in Palestine. But then later on, as Gentile converts swamped the Christian faith, and Jewish Christianity became more and more marginalized as some kind of weird cult on the sidelines. Then you suddenly had all the apostles as our apostles, the apostles for the Gentiles and the Jews. Did they have anything to do with it? Oh, well, I guess maybe they did. But of course, Jesus sent evangelists out to us. And I think that's why that happened. But it sure flies in the face of the New Testament.
What do you think about, look at his name real quick, Timothy Barnes? Timothy Barnes makes an argument that Ignatius died in the 140s CE because he thinks that that Ignatius quotes Ptolemy the Gnostic. So basically, do you think Ignatius's letters are familiar with Gnosticism?
He does know of Docetism. He says that that's why he quotes that thing that parallels Luke 24. Touch me and see, I am not a bodiless demon. He's trying to say that Jesus is already refuting Docetism, and it seems to me that he mentions it in connection with those who deny the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, because they stand and fall together. If you think that Jesus' body is not really present in the bread and the wine, then you must not think he was genuinely bodily present on earth as a human being. And that's crazy. And he knew there were people that thought that. Indeed, there were. And so I think he did know about Docetism. Now, you wouldn't have to be a Gnostic to be a Docetist. Like the guys that wrote some of the apocryphal Acts of the Apostles think that Jesus was too good to be soiled by contact with this stinking filth heap of a world. He must have been kind of a ghost, the Holy Ghost. And but they didn't necessarily believe in Gnosticism. And oh, there's some Gnostic material, the hymn of the pearl in the Acts of Thomas, and the round dance of the Savior in the Acts of John. But on the whole, though they're docetic, they're not Gnostic. They're Encretite, the anti-sex gospel. We've got to get ourselves back to the garden and celibacy and all that. So I'm not sure if Ignatius does have occasion to mention that. I mean, of course, Irenaeus does in spades, but I'm not sure if Ignatius does.
So you're not sure if Ignatius quotes Ptolemy the Gnostic.
Oh, I'm not. Which letter? Oh, he thinks that one of the Ignatian epistles is quoting. Uh,
All I remember is he said that Ignatius somewhere in his text quotes Ptolemy the Gnostic. That's all I remember at this time.
I've never run across that. I've paid some attention to both. I'll have to take a look at
Yeah.
them and see. That'd be very interesting.
Dr. Timothy Barnes, he's one of the few scholars, but there is a number of scholars out there that are doubting the consensus on Ignatius.
Good.
Although most still seem to be on board with the consensus stating involving J.P. Lightfoot's 7-letter collection.
Yeah, you know why people defended it so much? This was part of a two-pronged assault on the higher critics by Lightfoot, Westcott, and Hort. They were all trying to refute that and to say, oh no, there was not this split between Hellenistic and Jewish Christianities. You can't find that attested in the New Testament, which I think is absurd. Of course it's there. But he's there. The reason that Lightfoot was working on the Apostolic Fathers was he said, now these are second century works. If Bauer was right about the split between the types of Christianity, surely we would see some evidence of it here, and we don't. So Bauer's just making this up. Well, I remember in class at Montclair State once, the professor was talking about that, and I pointed out a passage in one of the Ignatian epistles where he seemed to be making reference to Ebionites. And I said, well, what about this? This would, and I was still a fundamentalist at the time, but I said, this wouldn't seem to fit that. I mean, this sounds like he does know of this Jewish Christianity and he doesn't buy it. And Dr. Streetman, one of my favorite professors, he said, well, I guess another generalization bites the dust. Yeah, but that's why they got into that, to show that, everybody was just a big happy family in the church. And you can see that from the good old Apostolic Fathers. And it's so naive, they didn't apparently even question the authorship. It was just a part of apologetics. Now, that doesn't really matter. It explains a couple of things, but any argument offered by any axe grinder could be valid, right? They could have been lucky enough to stumble on something that helps them make their case. You know, there's no reason to deny that. Well, if we do, it's the genetic fallacy. Well, I don't like that guy. I don't like where he's going with this, so I'm going to discount that evidence. You can't do that. You've got to weigh arguments one by one. So, that it might have been a good argument, but I don't think it was. And I think that I'm glad for the work these guys did on the text of the New Testament and the Apostolic Fathers. But, even they would not want work to cease on it. They would, I'm sure, want people to make new advances, though they prefer to see them advancing in a particular direction.
Got another super chat from PMC again. Thank you for your super chat. Follow up: if Polycarp added stories, Luke, do you think he believed in his own changes, or do you think he intentionally misled his followers for the greater good to defeat Marcion?
Let's see, what would he have added? Some of the stuff he added was parable material. That wouldn't necessarily be a deception. Oh, here's a great teeny little example. You know where in Mark Jesus says that nobody would pour new wine into an old leather wineskin because wine expands as it ferments, and the leather skin can expand only so far. But if you put new wine in it, it's going to have to, and it can't, and it's going to burst, and you've ruined both the wineskin and lost the wine. Uh, and then in Luke only, it says, but anyone who's tasted old wine and then new wine says, the old is better. Now, that has to be an anti Marcionite dig that there's a New Testament making the rounds. Oh, forget that. That's like new Coke. Let's just stick with the old good stuff. Now, he added that to, in his mind, correct this Marcionite leaning teaching in the gospel. I don't think, or it's like Matthew. This isn't a Marcionite related thing, but it's the same principle. Mark and Luke have Jesus asked about divorce. Is it ever licit? Can you do it legally by the Torah? And Jesus seems to say, well, I know it's written that you can, but that isn't really the will of God. In fact, anybody that divorces his wife, except no, yeah, anybody that divorces his wife and marries another is committing adultery and or making her commit adultery because she kind of has to get remarried to survive in the society. Well, what's the premise of that? God does not regard the initial marriage as dissolved. You may, but he doesn't. And in his eyes, it's adultery. Okay, so Jesus seems to be saying, no. I mean, technically you can, but God doesn't like it. Basically, bottom line, no. But in Matthew, it's the same, except he says if anybody divorces his wife, may epiporneia, uh, except for immorality. Uh, Usually they translate adultery, but that's a different word. That's moikia. And he uses porneia, which originally referred to prostitution, but came to mean moral, immoral action of whatever type. Well, what's happened there? Well, Matthew has certainly added this. And where did he get it? Well, from Deuteronomy, because there it speaks of how a man may divorce his wife for any unseemliness. Well, that's as wide open as you can drive a truck through, right? On purpose. It's left ambiguous to leave it up to you. And Matthew seems to be reintroducing the escape clause. If he divorces his wife for anything except for misbehaving, well then God doesn't like it. What's Matthew done there? Is he lying to his readers? Jesus didn't say this, but I'm going to convince the dopes that he did. No, no. The thing is, Matthew and Luke both regarded these gospels they were working with, Marcion's gospel in Luke's case, Mark's gospel in Matthew's case. They're both they both have the status of constitutional documents for religious communities. Well, what should I do, Father, about this? He says, well, let's see what our Lord said. They open up the gospel right here. He says, no divorce. Well, what Luke and Matthew have done is to amend the Constitution. They've seen in their experience that sometimes God's people cannot live up to these standards. And it's time to take the pressure off. Maybe we can relax it a bit because people still have hard hearts. And that's not, it's long past the idea of, is this actually a transcript of what Jesus said? Or is it to us a kind of a church constitution? And if it's the latter, we can amend it. We're not even getting into the question, we're not even thinking about what the historical Jesus said. These guys weren't the Jesus seminar, right? And so I think that's important. It's wrong to inject elements of deception and fraud into stuff like this. They were trying to improve these texts for use in their communities. And so I think that they changed it, but there's not that kind of motive involved.
Okay, we got another super chat. Let's take a look at it. Kevin Hogan, thank you for your super chat. Question 1: what new or old thinkers cause you to question older notions, not just about Ignatius, but compelling for how the second century faith evolved? All things. Paul was not first century, yes?
I agree. I don't think that, well, Paul, the historical Paul, whom I equate with Simon Magus, he may have been in the latter part of the first century, but his character, but the epistolary Paul, the construct of the apostle Paul we have may really go back to the second century and Marcion, kind of the Paul of history versus the Paul of faith, you might say. I do continue to be open to revise my opinions, like this theory of Marcus Vincent that the Gospels were based on a draft gospel by Marcion. Then others got a hold of it and did their own versions, and then he got a hold of them and used some of their material and did a definitive edition. I never would have thought of that, but having read his treatment of it, I'm inclined to go with him. I'm happy to accept the correction to my vaguer idea. And that's true of various things. The whole idea of mythicism. Years ago, I used to think that is lunacy. But then I began to look at the arguments over several years, and I finally decided I have to admit the case is better for a mythical Jesus than a historical one, though I'm open on that one, right? I'm trying my best to evaluate the evidence for Jesus the Zealot, and I find myself more and more open to that. So I'm kind of balancing mythicism and zealotry against one another these days. But I'm writing a book on world religions right now and studying a lot of stuff, including recent work on the early sources for Islamic origins and who Muhammad was, if he existed. And this opens questions I never thought of really. And I'm eager to hear more. I like to try to be challenged. This is why I say all theories have to be held tentatively. Even if you're pretty convinced, you've got to be willing to say, hey, I could be wrong. It's not an open and shut thing. And eventually, maybe I will read something that'll show me how wrong I am now. It's happened before, probably happen again.
Do you think that Paul's letters are being written around the same time as Ignatius's letters? Or do you think Ignatius came before Paul or vice versa?
Well, based on the church government stuff, I would think the Ignatian letters are a little bit later than the pastoral epistles, which I think are second century. The other Pauline epistles, so called, are probably earlier than that. I would guess right at the end of the first century. That partly that's as a result of comparing one group with another to see where things are at, how certain terms are used, what's happening to certain concepts like Christology or church structure, atonement doctrines, and all that. You can never, you don't know if it's a unilinear evolution, like from A to B to C to D. All sorts of things may be happening. So it's complicated, but there's a lot of stuff to keep your eye on. It's kind of like a taxonomy, like what was the name of the big taxonomist? Oh, can't think of it. Lyell, was that him? Anyway, de- deciphering all the different species and their similarities and so on, and how it, and then once genetics gets into it, what seems to have come from what and in what order. And when there are similarities, does that mean one came from the other, or they both developed independently, like winged creatures? Do you want to say that bats evolved from birds or birds from house flies? Nah, nah. They all, under similar circumstances, chanced to gradually evolve functioning wings. And But they did, but it was all independent. They didn't just, one didn't come from the other, and that may be the case with Christological parallels. Did John actually read Philo? It's so close. I'm tempted to think so, but that kind of middle Platonic conceptuality was in the air at the time. So who knows?
We have another super chat question from Kevin Hogan. Kevin Hogan, thank you for your super chat. Question 2, Block Heart Guess. Pre-Nicene New Testament changed my life direction. Is
Wow.
Marcion far more important or overstated in gospel reconstruction than once thought?
Oh yeah, I think so. Yeah, for centuries, people were just passively accepting what Tertullian and Justin Martyr and others said, that uh, Marcion's epistles and gospels they're missing a lot of parts of passages and stuff. And a lot of those have to do with Old Testament or Jewish material. Well, we know the guy tried to separate Christianity from Judaism, so I bet he cut that stuff out. He didn't really want Old Testament material gumming up the New Testament of his creation. So yeah, he shortened it, and Tertullian used to call Marcion the Pontic mouse, because he was from Pontus and he was like the mouse chewing up papyrus, and pretty funny. Uh, but some of the, I think Ritschl and some of the other Tübingen critics, disciples of F.C. Bauer, argue that no, I think you got the cart before the horse there. It looks like Marcion was using an earlier version of all these materials, and that as his scripture caught on like crazy all over the Mediterranean, and people were converting to Marcionism, going to their synagogues, is what they called them, reading his New Testament. This was perceived as a big threat by the Catholic Church, and Polycarp in particular. And so it appears that he got a hold of the Marcionite versions and started padding them out. I gave a kind of silly little example before. Nobody having drunk new wine, no, nobody who's drunk old wine wants to bother with new wine. He says the old's good enough for me. Well, he added stuff like that. He wasn't really at liberty to cut out stuff that people knew was there. And if they're reading, oh, where's my favorite passage? Hey, what the heck? Where is it? Just like when the RSV came out and people were looking for the woman taken in adultery, and they said, where is it? Where'd it go? Oh, it's in a footnote in tiny little type. Hey, what is this? I want my money back. Well, he didn't dare do that. He knew what people were like. And so he added stuff to correct it, even if it contradicted something. He figured, well, people will read along, they'll see what I've put in there, and they'll say, oh, well, that's good that that's there, because up until that point, I thought this was saying something else. Now I see it's not. Now I get the point. I wonder why it was written that way. Well, that was done a good bit in the ancient world. You had to correct it. You couldn't just cut the stuff out and redo it. So, so it seems to me that if anybody was tampering with the text, it was the Orthodox or Catholics. And again, it wasn't that they're trying to pull the wool over your eyes. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. They just said, hey, here are normative texts that are teaching certain religious doctrines, and some of them seem heretical to us. Now, we want people to use these texts, but we don't want them getting misled by some of this strange stuff. Let's see if we can kind of calm it down a bit and sanitize it for use among right-thinking Christians. And that's what they did. They wrote the pastoral epistles to give us a kind of Catholic-sounding Paul. They added several bits and pieces to the other Pauline letters and First Peter to make them sound less radical, less heretical. They added these bits and pieces, like chapters 1 and 2, which almost sound like they're right out of the Old Testament. They added them on, and then various bits and pieces elsewhere. And then he wasn't done yet, because there were other heretical gospels people were reading. Like even Matthew, which was largely friendly to the Old Testament and New Testament. Marcionites must have gotten a hold of that one at some point, because Polycarp, I think, somebody anyway, perceived Matthew as denigrating the Old Testament. So what does Jesus start out his ministry saying in the canonical version, the Polycarp version? Don't go thinking I've come to abolish the law and the prophets. Oh no, I've come to fulfill them. Heaven and earth could pass away before a single comma could pass away from the text of the Torah. And furthermore, if anybody goes around teaching that you could disregard the least important commandment, and then he does it and teaches others to, he's going to have the lowest position. He's going to be one of the Shudras in the kingdom of heaven. But anybody who keeps every single commandment and teaches others to do that, well, he's going to be top of the heap. Who could he be talking about? Who is it that thinks Christ came to abolish the Jewish scriptures, the law and the prophets? Well, I can think of one guy, and that's Marcion. So it looks like that was kind of fiddled with by Polycarp, and even Mark. Now this is more iffy in my mind, but there is some reason to think, based on the studies of my pal Stephen Huller, that Mark may have begun as a Gnostic gospel by Basilides, and that was originally called the Gospel According to the Egyptians. We have bits of it from Nag Hammadi, and that there was some added material or longer material mentioning some of the same characters, like Salome, the mother of James and John, is in both the Gospel According to the Egyptians and in this longer secret Markan material. And a woman from the Carpocratian sect who used that longer mark went to Rome and met Polycarp. And Hermann thinks that she shared a copy of it with Polycarp, who said, this gospel has a lot of good stuff in it, but I don't know about this here. Maybe I'll cut that out. And that what he did was to take what we call the secret gospel of Mark, abbreviated, and that's our Gospel of Mark. Who knows what resurrection appearances may have looked like, if there were any, because there's not any in the canonical version. So It seems to me there really is reason to believe that the canonical New Testament was, as it stands now, is largely the work of Polycarp. Beyond that, I'm forgetting the rest of the question about the pre.
Okay, let me go back.
Oh yeah, he's very important, extremely important. If Marcus Vincent is right, Marcion basically was the fundamental gospel writer to which other people added stuff. And according to Stephen Huller and others, he was important as the one who prompted the redactions that sanitized the New Testament that we now use.
So when would you date Polycarp's letter? Do you think that was written in the mid second century, late second century, or early second century?
I would guess the first quarter of the second century. It's got to be around the same time as the pastorals, if he did write both, as P.N. Harrison and others have argued, because there's a couple of lines in the Polycarp epistle that could be read as quotations from one of the pastorals. But on the theory that Polycarp wrote all of those, then he's just using a phrase again that he liked. I'm beginning to get a sore throat here. I'm going to have to call it quits in a minute, I'm afraid.
Let's take a look at this last super chat then before we go off.
Sure.
Kevin Hogan, thank you for your super chat. Question 3. Polycarp makes sense, yes. What made readers believe 1600 years ago and today think Ignatius' opinions matter? Question 3A. Could Marcion have been Q or similar? Marcion puzzles me.
Well, in effect, he sort of was Q. And now it's possible he had, if Q did exist as a discrete document, kind of like the Gospel of Thomas or something, then Marcion could have decided, hey, this is pretty good. I'm going to incorporate this, or at least parts of it. And then once it got, his gospel got redacted, split up, rewritten by other authors, then you're really multiplying the Q problem, trying to reconstruct it. You really got a crowded field of sources to work with. But yeah, it's not incompatible with him using some of the sources that gospel critics hypothesize. And it was the basic, you say Q or similar. Yeah, it does appear that his seminar handout sheet, his gospel draft, was the common basis for the 4 gospels. That's even Qer than Q. Now, what the readers, why would they take Ignatius seriously, and would they even have heard of him? Well, yeah, apparently because there are hints in Paul's epistles that news traveled between churches about, oh, did you hear the Thessaloniki Christians are getting persecuted? Or in Philippi, I hear they're starving over there in Achaia. Let's take up some relief for them. And or Paul will say, I hear from the other churches how well you're doing. Now, who knows who wrote it, but that does show a kind of mundane but plausible description of inter-church communication. You've got outposts of a new sect. It wouldn't have been that tough to keep straight. I mean, they had postal services back then and couriers and all that. So probably, since Ignatius was apparently a pretty big name anyway, if he was martyred, whether it happened in Antioch or Rome, that would have been of major interest to a lot of Christians. Of course, naturally, they're thinking, well, gee, when's it going to happen to me? So it was very relevant to them. And also the fact that he, if this they believe that all martyrs and confessors were at the crucial moment filled with the Holy Spirit, perhaps they didn't even feel the pain of what was happening if they were a martyr because of this. And they were in a kind of oracular state of communion with God. And sometimes they would say things that seemed to be of a prophetic nature. And so people viewed them as kind of oracles. And so if you get a letter that says this is by the famous martyr, the blessed Ignatius, people would be interested in what he'd have to say. I mean, me, I'm just some rank and file 2-bit Christian. What have I got to say? I can half remember a few Bible passages. But if this guy says it, it's going to be worth hearing. I remember I took my daughter Victoria to hear Elie Wiesel speak at, what was it, Peace College or Meredith College, I forget which one, in Raleigh years ago now. And he was pretty old, of course, and he had survived Auschwitz. Right? And I didn't know how long he would be in this world with us anymore. So I wanted Victoria to hear him. And I remember in the car on the way, I said, Victoria, this is really something. This is like going to see the prophet Isaiah speak. And she always remembered it. And that, I think, is the kind of thing. Oh, Polycarp wrote this? Well, let's hear it. So it makes sense to me. It isn't just like some, you can well imagine somebody just cooking this thing up and say, here, and I want this read in church, and you just using his name. Could be, but even if you were, that's why people would sit up and take notice.
Well, thanks for joining me today, Dr. Price.
Oh, always a pleasure.
And I'll see you tomorrow.
Okay, great. What's the topic then?
Yeah, we're going to be talking about the Acts of Paul.
Oh, boy. Great stuff.
Yeah, we need to get into that. I'll see everybody tomorrow at 6 p.m. Central Time. Thanks again, Dr. Price.
Oh, thank you.
Anytime. Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.